Yes, it's Joe Walsh.
It's like your favorite station.
Hey y'all, this is Kristin Casey, author of Rock Monster, My Life with Joe Walsh.
Just like they do on the radio.
And you are listening to Joe K on the Play That Rock and Roll podcast. Now it's all about the podcast, and I'm telling you, Joe K is one of the best.
This is not a test. This is Play That Rock and Roll Podcast Edition. I'm your host, Joseph K., and like the song at the start says, just call me Joe. Speaking of Joe, how you doing? I'm doing great. And I'm doing great because for the first time, it's not just me today. That's right, Play That Rock and Roll is pleased to announce our first ever guest. Today is our first ever interview, and that was with Kristin Casey, author of Rock Monster, My Life with Joe Walsh. If you're familiar with this show, you know I'm a huge fan of Joe Walsh. I did a podcast, a two-part podcast about Joe earlier this year, and in that podcast I discussed Kristin's book quite a bit. If you're not familiar, Rock Monster was released originally in 2018, and paperback copies are being released this month. Signed copies are available too, I might add. Kristin was Joe's girlfriend from the late 80s to the mid 90s. If you remember my podcasts about Joe, or if you're a Joe Walsh fan, you probably know that those are the years that are the least written about when it comes to his career. And there's a simple explanation for that. Those years were basically commercial and personal low points for him. Not only were his records not selling, but his addictions to drugs and alcohol were spiraling completely out of control. Well, as fate would have it, Kristin was there for all of it, and she put together a fantastic account of her story. And it is a great window into a point in Joe's life and career that we as fans don't have a lot of access to. I originally got the book last year as a Christmas gift, and it was the first nonfiction book that I read this year. And when I read the book, I hadn't even launched this podcast. I was still in the process of figuring out what exactly I wanted this to be. But as soon as I finished the book, I did know I definitely wanted to talk to Kristin about it because it is a very interesting read, and I had a lot of questions. After I read the book, I posted a review of it on Twitter, and I sent it to her. She saw it, messaged me saying that she appreciated it. And over the next couple of months, we went back and forth a couple of times on social media. She provided me some great information that I did end up using in my Joe Walsh podcast episode. And since the paperback edition of her book has just been released this month, I thought it would be a great opportunity to see if she would be interested in coming on the show to talk about it. And much to my delight, she agreed. And I couldn't be happier to present her as the debut guest of Play That Rock and Roll. We had a fantastic conversation, and we talked about all kinds of interesting stuff. So if you're a rock fan or a Joe Walsh fan, I really hope you hang out to listen to what we talk about. Among the stuff we discuss is Joe's infamous sidekick, Rick the bass player, Rick Rosas. We talk about this album, Got Any Gum. We talk about Joe's long-forgotten attempt at a supergroup, which was called The Best. We talk about the Eagles attempting to reunite in 1990, and we talk about their proper Hell Freezes Over reunion in 1994. Beyond the music, we also talk about what it's like being a non-celebrity in a celebrity world. Her stories of being backstage at Eagles concerts and at all sorts of VIP parties. Really interesting stuff. And in the later half of the interview, we talk about one of the most complicated topics in all of rock and roll. underage groupies. Kristin was never a groupie, but she has some very interesting insight to that topic, and I thought she brought up some great points. So, just a heads up on that, but I think it was a really good conversation all the way through. We cover a lot of great stuff, and to be honest, the whole ordeal was a best case scenario for me. I originally planned to only talk to her for about an hour, but that hour came and went real quick. And after we hit the hour mark, I realized I had all sorts of questions left over for her, so she very graciously agreed to hang out for another hour, and honestly even more than that. And the good news there is that means that this interview is actually a two-parter. Today is just part one. I'll have the second half of our discussion up sometime next week. So in short, I can't thank her enough. We had 2 great hours of conversation, covered all kinds of great topics, and like I said, it was a best case scenario for the debut interview for Play That Rock and Roll. Now, if you want to learn more about Kristin, I would point you to her website, which is KristinCasey.com. You can find her social media pages there. I know she's Ms. Kristin Casey on Twitter, and you can follow her on Facebook too. You can also find her writings on her website. You can find information about her profession as an intimacy coach on her website. We talk more about that in the second interview that I'll be posting next week. And most importantly of all, you can find out how to buy her book on her website, which again is available now in paperback, and signed copies are also available. And if you're interested in signed copies, you should really jump on those now, because you never really know just how long those will be available. And finally, just one quick note about a little hiccup we had with the audio. I recorded this podcast on a webcam, a brand new webcam that a number of YouTube tutorials told me had a great mic on it. Well, guess what? The mic sucked. So Kristin's audio sounds great, but my audio on this webcam sounded like I was underwater. So in an effort to fix that, I replaced the audio of my questions with audio I pulled from my camcorder recording, which I had going as a backup. My audio isn't perfect now, but it sounds better than it did. And I only bring this up because if you're listening closely, you'll probably notice a fluctuation in the sound between my questions and Kristin's answers. Not the biggest deal, but it does frustrate me on my end, and I just wanted to give you a heads up about it. I will sort this audio thing out sooner than later. The important thing is that Kristin's audio sounded just fine. There's a slight issue with mine, but you can just tune me out and pay attention to her, because her words are what's important here. So without further ado, let's dive in to the debut interview for Play That Rock and Roll, which was my discussion with Kristin Casey, author of Rock Monster, My Life with Joe Walsh. This book sounds like a real big hit on, I hope this isn't a disrespectful term, but like the recovery circuit. Like there's and a lot of, you've had a lot of great discussions about, addiction and survival and recovery and all that good stuff. I will tell you that I do have some questions about that for you, but I think I will get in over my head really quickly if I ask too many questions. So this will probably be, more about, the lighter aspects of the book, But, hopefully we can get to some of the heavier topics too. I just hope I don't put my foot in my mouth when I ask.
Oh, I'm sure you won't. I mean, that's the thing about this book, and always has been. It really has 2 audiences, and there's definitely some overlap between, the rock and roll scene and the addiction recovery world. Almost by default, there's some overlap there. But most of the podcasts I've done are probably recovery oriented. I think probably just because I found more of those to reach out to. And the impetus to write the book was more to share my story of addiction than anything else, you know. But I did also want to share what it's like behind the scenes, because it's not what everyone thinks it is, you know, in the rock and roll scene. So some of my interviews are very recovery centric, very, you know, very much about addiction, and you know, it's not the funnest topic,
Right.
especially if you're not an addict, you know, and that's what you didn't read the book for that. It can be a downer.
Well, it's a window into like what that life really is, and it helps an understanding in it. And I think it's good. I think it would be good for people who, you know, don't struggle with addiction to read it, because it's a window into something that they might be judgmental about, you know, and that certainly breaks all that down, because, man, the later chapters of this book were so gripping. I genuinely felt like somehow this was like a posthumous release.
You weren't quite sure I actually survived.
I couldn't believe you pulled through, and thank God for, you know, the ending, though. It's a very sweet ending. I won't ruin it, but like, you know, your story of getting out and the closure that you get at the end of the book is very, the relief is great, you know. When I read the book, the only story that it sort of reminded me to, and I don't want to compare because they're definitely different stories, but I read Mackenzie Phillips's High on Arrival about 10 years ago. Oh, excuse me, about 5 years ago. She put it out about 10 years ago. And did you read that book?
Oh, yes.
That-
it was one of my favorites.
That is such an intense story too. So this is like, when you were putting this book together, did you talk to or contact authors like Mackenzie, or, and again, this isn't a good comp, but I think of her because there are some parallels with your story, Pamela DeBar, I'm with the band. Did you have any contact with authors who put together memoirs or stories like this to give you guidance?
Yeah, to some degree, not a large degree. I would say the ones the one that I was the most in contact with was an incredible writer and woman named Sarah Catherine Lewis, and she doesn't have anything to do with the rock and roll world, but she wrote. She's a former stripper and addict, and she wrote a book that had a lot to do with her, with that part of her life. And she came through town and we met and we just really connected. We both had blogs at the time. We both had stripper blogs at the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And she seems to have sort of disappeared, and I'm not sure where she went. So if anyone watching this knows where Sarah Catherine Lewis is, please let me know, and I'd love to be back in touch with her. You know, I read a ton of addiction memoirs, and also I love, you know, all sex worker memoirs, strippers and escorts.
Yeah.
So there was a Jenny Ketchum has a wonderful one. She was a porn actress, and I wasn't in touch with her, or Antonia Crane. Antonia Crane has another wonderful book, a little like Sarah Catherine Lewis's. As far as the rock and roll world, Pamela DeBar's I was in touch with, and she so graciously wrote a wonderful blurb for my book jacket. We had the same agent, Peter McGuigan. Yeah. And, you know, when I first read Pamela's I'm with the band, it's funny to me now that I actually have a blurb on my book. I mean, if you'd have told me then that I was actually going to write a book, and that you know, the amazing Miss Pamela was going to write a blurb, I would have said, okay, well then I can die happy. You know, now I have no worries in life, because I was so impressed. She was so groundbreaking with what she did. The way she owns her sexuality and just has and she got all kinds of hell for it from, you know, a lot of pearl clutching people out there who don't understand, you know, what groupiedom is or can be, or the way, you know, she expressed it. And then when the book came out, I got in touch with women who actually got in touch with me were connected to her. Some women who'd had rock and roll flings or relationships, so we've all connected on Facebook, and who's that guy from the Partridge Family? Bonaducci. I did it. His ex-wife, she and I had a lot of similarities. What's her name?
I don't know her name, but I know Danny is a pretty intense fellow.
Yes, and yeah, so she really understood. She and I are very different women, and I feel terrible for going blank on her name right now because her book's really interesting and very good. But the main similarity was that our partners were very intense, out of control addicts. She was not one. She had like a codependent kind of thing, She was always trying to manage him and his craziness, and so there were a lot of similarities. Trying to think of the other any rock and roll chicks that wrote memoirs. I'm probably forgetting some. Amy Dresner, she wasn't a rock and roll chick. She's a wonderful memoirist who wrote My Fair Junkie. We got in touch as well right after her book came out, right before mine came out. So a handful, like half a dozen of them. Yeah, and it's been great because you kind of feel alone in this world when you have that experience. And I'm not a super social extroverted person. And so Pamela's group of ladies that she wrote a book where some of them contributed stories.
Right, yeah.
Their own personal stories. I can't think of the name of that one either now.
Let's Spend the Night Together?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So they get together every year, or, not this year because of the pandemic, but so they've invited me out to the next get together, and we might be doing it online this year. I don't know. So hopefully I'll be meeting some of those ladies in person because they're fantastic and they just get me and they get what it's like.
Yeah, she still seems to be like the queen of, maybe not the groupies anymore, but definitely has a very strong following and a close circle. I have a lot of admiration for her as well, Yeah. So it was.
Yeah, she wrote an article. She wrote a couple articles recently in it's an online magazine called Please Kill Me, which it's absolutely worth going there and reading. She details more of her relationships and they're just fantastic and fascinating.
Good stuff. Okay, well let's dive into your book and I'll go through it sort of pseudo chronologically. You first came into Joe Walsh's life in 1987, right?
88.
88. Okay, so you met him in 88, and you met him through Rick Rosas' girlfriend.
Yeah, loosely I would call her his girlfriend.
Okay.
Rick, as long as I knew Rick, I never knew him until much later in life, shortly before he died a few years back, to have one girlfriend.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He had, usually when I would see him with the woman, it would be the same woman for, 6 months, depending on what city we were in,
Oh, okay.
Like there might be two women he was seeing simultaneously, but yeah, he moved around a lot. But my friend Vicky that I worked with in Austin at Sugars, we stripped together. She was an amazing woman, still is an amazing woman. And she's kind of a role model for me. She was a few years older and she was a real rocker chick. She was from Detroit. She'd been going, getting backstage for years. I wouldn't call her a groupie, but she loved rock and roll. Like she knew the music. She was all about the music. And she turned me on to a lot of rock and roll, like, Peter Frampton and Ted Nugent. And, because I was 18 when I met her. And I didn't really fit in with the other strippers, but I fit in with Vicky, and so we'd hang out after work and go to her place at 2 a.m, and from 2 to 4 she would just be playing me like the best 70s rock that and like schooling me kind of, in rock and roll history, whatever, and at some point she had met Rick and Joe when they came through town, like probably in 87, at an autograph signing party at a record store here in Austin. And she and Rick just immediately hit it off and kind of started dating. And all I knew at the time, when I'm at work, I'm really busy. She said something about dating this bass player. She may have mentioned he played with Joe Walsh, but the name meant nothing to me. So if she mentioned it, it went in one ear and out the other. And then one day, a few months into this, she says, "Oh, so the guys are in town. Take me to the hotel after work if you could. I need a ride." And I was like, yeah, sure. And I actually, at the last minute, decided the guy I was seeing kind of casually was getting too serious and I needed to go break up with him that night. So I tried to get out of taking her to the hotel. And she's like, no. She literally pulled this guy out of my car in the parking lot. She's like, you promised me a ride. And thank God she did that. So on the way to the hotel, she's like, when you drop me off, park the car, come in. I want you to meet my bass player's, friend, the singer, guitar player. I think you guys will hit it off. So it was, I think, kind of a, subversive fix-up. She waited till I was in the car. And I was like, I don't want to meet anybody, but, why not? Yeah, he'll probably be interesting. I figured he was I liked older men, but I figured he was some kind of one-hit wonder from the 70s, but still, I'd meet him and then, probably, fake a yawn and go home 15 minutes later. And 15 minutes later, I was, this close to being in love. And really, I mean, within 20 minutes, I thought I've met the man I'm going to marry. I was really in love, and I stayed till like 8 in the morning. And then the next day went to the concert that they were playing. And that's when I realized who he was, because I started recognizing every single song he played. And I was just like, I had no idea that he was that famous or that, prolific. And so no, I'd fallen in love with him thinking he was just some one-hit wonder from the 70s.
That's funny. Yeah, I've seen Joe in concert a handful of times, and he's one of those guys where like every song I've heard on the radio, it's just he's just got such a catalog of great hits. But before we talk about Joe, I want to circle back to Rick a little bit, because I feel like Rick the bass player gets mentioned a whole bunch of times along with Joe, but like I haven't read any profiles of him ever, and I think now that he's gone, he's sort of underappreciated, at least in rock history. What do you remember about Rick as far as his personality went, and how his friendship with Joe was like?
I'm so glad you asked. First of all, thank you for that, because I tell you, and anyone who knows or knew Rick will say this, he was a very special person. This world was a better place with him in it, and I will never not miss him. And I know Joe feels the same. They had an incredibly close relationship, and it was such a beautiful thing. I feel like in some ways Rick was probably more important in Joe's life than I was, or more important, well, certainly more important to his work, but more of a stabilizing factor. Rick was a very chill guy. And, Joe was always, he always had to be on. He sort of had to be, whether he was on stage or doing interviews or, he was the guy in charge. Everyone in our circle basically worked for him, even his good friends like Joe Vitale, his drummer, and Rick the bass player. But basically everyone was on his payroll. And yet Rick and him had such a genuine friendship. I mean, and Joe noticeably just relaxed around him, and Rick just sort of organically brought out Joe's, funny side, not where he was like trying to be funny, just where he, they just kind of played off each other, because Rick was really so much the straight man. And he was, I think that it was just a really important friendship. And also he was one hell of a solid bass player, and like my musician friends all, like he's just very, very solid. He wouldn't have played with Neil Young for as long as he did if he wasn't an amazing bass player.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and he's
rhythm
a great
section gets no respect.
What's that?
I said rhythm section gets no respect.
Oh, I know, right? Bass players are always, they hold the band together.
Yeah.
And yet they don't get, a lot of, they don't get all the attention and accolades. But I'll tell you, Rick was hilarious. We spent more time in that guy's garage, just like laughing my butt off. I loved him. And in fact, shortly before he died, which I want to say was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
We would talk. Do you
I
remember?
have to look it up. I think 2014, but I could be on that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. We would talk every couple of years, and he was actually seeing someone in Austin, but he had a girlfriend in LA, and it was very complicated. So he was coming out here once in a while, and we never could connect. And our last conversation was like, yeah, next time you're out here, we got to get together. And then just very soon after that, he died.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's cool that you guys stayed in touch. I remember watching a Joe on Howard Stern show a couple years, well, actually more than a couple years ago now, and he was talking about coming out of addiction, one of the things you have to do is basically cut all the toxic people out of your life, all the enablers, all the people that get you into trouble. And that was why he hadn't gone on Howard Stern's show in like 20 years or whatever it was. And they asked about Rick, and Joe said Rick was exempt. You know, he stayed in touch with Rick. You know, he didn't cut him out for whatever reason. So, yeah, I just wanted to know a little bit more. So it sounds like you and Rick got along really well, too.
Yeah, and it's a good thing. I mean, I never had a crossword with him. I never had a negative thought about him. I would have to assume he probably... I don't think he ever thought poorly of me. I think that there were probably times that he thought Joe and I might be better off apart because we, you know, when things were getting so bad, we were fighting all the time. But I never felt anything but, you know, love from him. And, you know, he was as much, unless Joe and I were actively being intimate, you know, Rick had carte blanche. It was almost like a threesome, you know, like a non-sexual threesome. Like he was over so often. When we bought our house in Studio City, he lived as the crow flies, like a mile. And so the guys got some, this was before texting, or, you know, anyone had computers, or at least, you know, the internet as we know it. And so Joe got a couple of CB radios, and the guys would just communicate literally on CB radios just whenever they... I mean, yeah, he was a very major part of our life, and I loved having him around. And he was, you know, he was a real practical joker, but never in a way that was offensive or anything like that. I just really love the guy.
Yeah, that's great. Did you ever meet Neil Young?
Yes, yeah. I met him in New Zealand. We hung out a few times. I don't recall Neil being personable with me whatsoever. Neil to me, seemed much more comfortable being the center of attention than Joe did. And I think Joe appreciated that, because whenever the two of them were in a room, I noticed that Joe seemed much more relaxed because most of the focus was on Neil, because he was just very comfortable being the center of attention. But it wasn't like he was one of those celebrities who was super gracious and like, you know, like Pete Townsend. If we would bump into Pete would go out of his way to come over and give me a big hug. You know, so would Ringo, ask me how I'm doing, like genuinely want to know, how are you doing? How's your sister? Blah, blah, blah. Whereas Neil, I mean, even the third time that we hung out in the span of like a few weeks in New Zealand, if someone had asked him my name, he might have been like, that's Joe's girl, I think.
Yeah.
You know, that's what he would have said then. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, so when you got together with Joe, he was just coming off of this album, Got Any Gum, part of my vinyl collection. I think he was still promoting it in '88. Do you remember him talking about the album at all? Was he excited about it, or when you and him got together, was like the writing on the wall that this didn't sell very well?
I did meet him on that tour. You know, I don't know if he played, I don't remember if the concert I saw him at, it was a festival, so there were like 6 people on the bill that day.
Oh, okay.
So he probably just played his classics. I probably went out and got that record right afterwards, but I bought all of his, I bought everything I could find, and that was not one that I listened to as much as the others.
Sure.
You know, I was much more into, you know, his stuff from the Barnstorm and James Gang and and solo stuff. You know, that was really my thing. But I do remember him enjoying playing when he would play like the radio song, and like I think he liked, you know, I don't know if he liked every song he did on that record, but yeah, I got the sense that he was proud of some of it, or proud of it to an extent. And we got together in May of that year of '88. By the time we really started spending time together again, which started probably like in August, maybe, you know, a few months later, like July or August or something. I think the tour was winding down a little bit, and I didn't know him very well. And Joe's not the kind of person who is super open with his feelings. You know, I mean, first, I'm Generation X, and men in my generation aren't, you know, certainly nearly as much as like millennials, but Joe's a boomer, you know. I mean, he was, and but I would watch him and get to know him, and so I could see signs, you know, that the venues were smaller and smaller, and I picked up on the frustration.
One thing I noticed from, I guess, this tour cycle in like 87, 88 is he gets booked on a lot of talk shows, Letterman and Arsenio, and they always mention this album, but he never talks about it, and he never plays any of the music for it in the performance section. He always plays something he's probably a little more comfortable with, like Rocky Mountain Way, Life in the Fast Lane. And maybe I'm reading too deep into it, but that always gave me the impression that he wasn't totally confident behind the music on this one.
Well, I think, yeah, he knows. Any artist, I think, really, most artists know their best work, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
And they, you know, and again, Joe wanted to please his fans, and if they want to hear Rocky Mountain Way versus the radio song, I mean, he's gonna play that.
Yeah. Hey, but maybe he doesn't hate it, because I will say, listen, you know, he's got that radio show now on 88.5 in California, and he did play the radio song this past Saturday. So it can't, you know, I think he has a soft spot for it somewhere.
Well, he should. I mean, I like that song, and in fact, it grows on me every time I hear it. I think I like it a little bit more than I did before. And in fact, I always thought, for all three of those albums, that one, Ordinary Average Guy, and Songs for a Dying Planet, I thought I could see some of Joe's songwriting talent, and I could see the potential in a lot of those songs that maybe could have used like different arrangements, or a better producer, somebody who would get him, you know, back into that funky rock groove versus, you know, the other thing is, the way the 50s and 60s rock and roll sort of segued into, you know, the 70s rock and you know, sort of psychedelic, and it was almost sort of seamless. You could see the progression and the influences, but then you get to the 80s, and, you know, a lot of soul just sort of got lost. And so he was, you know, I think the cocaine probably had an effect on his creative output, but I also think a lot of the music that was coming out at that time, a lot of synthesizers and stuff, you know, I think that was influencing him in a negative way. And I feel like if he'd have been writing some of those songs at a different time period, they would have had, you know, slightly different arrangements and maybe come out more in that Joe Walsh style that we all know and love.
Yeah.
You know?
I think you're onto something. The 80s were interesting because the 80s were really good to a lot of artists from the 60s. A lot of 60s artists had comeback hits in the 80s, but the 80s were also absolutely brutal to a lot of 70s acts. Like 1980 came and they just crashed right into it and couldn't make the jump. And I think Joe sort of had mixed results, because like his early 80s stuff is some of my absolute favorites, you know, even more than, you know, Barnstorm and his more critically favorited stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so in 1990, this is one of those things where why I love your book so much is it's such a window into the aspects of Joe's life that aren't really written about anywhere else. I knew about his tour with the band The Best in Japan, but I know nobody else I knew about it, and I didn't know much about it, and I still really don't. But your stories of like what that show was like was so interesting to me, because it's something that isn't written about anywhere else. And so of course I feel I got to ask about it. What was that tour all about? How did you enjoy it? And was that supposed to go beyond just the dates in Japan and Hawaii, or was it a sort of a one-off deal?
No, I think it was supposed to continue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I'm not 100% clear on why it didn't. Again, Joe didn't, you know, and I didn't ask. I mean, I'm sure if I'd have asked, he would have told me. Or maybe I asked and he didn't get too deep into it. And I was the kind of person who's like, you know, I'm not going to push. But no, I think the plan was to, keep it going. Maybe he was sort of inspired by what Ringo had been doing. And, all the guys were very excited about it. I remember rehearsals, all the guys being super excited about it. So I don't know. I don't know what combination of factors or any major factors that just kind of caused it to fall apart once they got back. But yeah, what I remember of that tour, unfortunately, is a little choppy because I was drinking heavily.
Yes.
I was going to say, my memory of seeing some of those videos of the best on YouTube is like, I've seen a lot of videos of Joe, and I've definitely seen him perform pretty intoxicated. But when I think of the performances or appearances that he is the drunkest that I've ever seen, it's those videos. And I sort of thought like, maybe that was where some of the trouble started.
This is a song by our wonderful bass player here, Mr. John Entwistle.
This is my favorite song in the whole set.
Me too.
I don't care about my songs.
Well, I tell you, there's definitely a reason for that, or at least one of the reasons for that, which was that in the States, Joe was a coke addict, as I had become by then, and we could get coke anywhere we wanted in the States.
Oh.
When we left the country, we could not. And so what happens, as most addicts will tell you, if you can't get your drug of choice, you're going to compensate with something. That's the nature of addiction. It's not like you're going to choose to do that. I didn't choose to drink I was a heavy drinker to begin with. I didn't choose to drink twice as much in Japan. My body was craving it because I could get coke. So, I think that's what the same thing was happening with Joe. He didn't have any cocaine when we were in Japan. If he did, I don't know where he got it, and it would have been an incredibly small amount. But I mean, as bad of an addict as he wasn't insane. He would not have been looking to score coke in Japan. Even of all countries, that would not have been the one who would have tried to do that, So we were drinking a lot. We were fighting a lot. I remembered some of the shows were, I liked some parts of it, but my main memory is that I thought Keith Emerson's solo was too long. And that I got bored. I mean, they only did like 5 gigs or something, and by halfway through I got bored, and in the last couple I spent backstage, I think.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because you wrote that same thing about Emerson and in your book, and that was I almost pulled that quote to ask you about, because I like prog rock as a casual fan, and I think that every music fan that isn't specifically a prog rock fan would say, God, that keyboard solo is too long on any prog song. So I thought that was pretty great.
I never have known if it was just me or not, and I've tried to watch that tape. I found it online myself, and it was a while ago. It was probably when I was writing the book, and I don't remember if I made it all the way through.
Oh yeah.
Painful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So were the rest of the guys in that group partying pretty hard with you guys, or was it like just Joe and I guess Entwistle?
Joe and Entwistle. I don't remember. I'm going blank on the singer's name, but I don't remember him ever being drunk. Simon, the drummer, I don't remember him.
Simon Phillips.
The brothers were there, if I recall. The backup singers, they were not hardcore partiers. Who else? Skunk Baxter. I don't remember him ever being drunk. No,
with that nickname? Come on.
I know. Well, you know where that nickname came from is apparently he didn't used to, like in the 70s, used to bathe all that often, and so he would, yeah, so that's where that came from. All I know is that I adored Skunk very much, and he was always spring fresh.
Oh, good, okay.
Never once smelled that. In fact, I remember Skunk as being incredibly gentlemanly and very sweet and very thoughtful, and especially in Japan, in fact, because he could see that I was drinking too much and that Joe and I were fighting. And every day he would just, kind of check on me, see how I was doing. He couldn't have been sweeter. I adored him.
Wow. Okay. That's sweet.
Yeah. Skunk was a real sweetheart. His parents were there. They were lovely. So it was, and I don't remember how much Entwistle drank before shows, but yeah, which might have been a lot. I just don't remember.
Sure.
But definitely, and I first met John at a party. When I first got together with Joe, we were in LA and we were at a party at Sean Carcian, who worked at the limo company that we used. He was a good friend of Joe's. He's passed away now. But I met him at a party there, and it was just him and I, John Entwistle and I, in the kitchen. And I vaguely knew who he was. I think we'd been introduced, but he was wasted. He was just beyond wasted, and he kept talking to me, and I could only understand half of what he was saying, and I couldn't tell if he was flirting with me or not, because it was just the strangest conversation. But he was adorable, and when he wasn't drunk, he was actually quite shy and reserved, but sweet. I really liked John a lot. He was lovely. When he was drunk, he'd be really outgoing and silly. And in Japan, our last night there, he was again like ridiculously wasted, and he would go from like this very proper, quiet English guy to just like, security was coming up to the room repeatedly because he was being so loud.
That's funny. The ox in sort of a different way, right?
Yeah.
You were present at those sort of botched Eagles reunion sessions, right?
Yeah, it was just a couple of days, if I recall.
Okay, so I guess this is sort of the lawyer portion of the show in case Henley comes calling, so we'll just say allegedly across the board for everything we discuss. Settle down, Don. But that's another thing where, like, even in the Eagles documentary, they barely touch on that little attempt at a reunion. Do you remember when Joe got the news that they wanted to put it back together in 1990?
Everything that I remember, I put in the book, and it was basically that we were at the Bellage Hotel,
Okay.
Which was not far from Joe's penthouse in Westwood, and when we, trashed the penthouse until the maid could get there, we'd move into the Bellage Hotel, which is now the London. And I was sleeping, and Joe woke me up, and he's like, we gotta go. Like, that was the first I'd heard of it. Like
okay.
Yeah, like I think talks may have been going on for a while, but he just didn't want to get his hopes up or something. I don't think he got one call and it was all of a sudden get your ass there. I think, and plus I wasn't living with him yet at this time, so I was on the road with him. I had my place in Austin, so I'd go home for a week or two and then go with him for a week or two. So there might have been some talks going on when I wasn't with him. So I got to LA, we move into the Bellage, and all of a sudden he wakes me up as excited as can be. Like, I don't know if I'd ever seen him. The only time I probably had ever seen him that excited was when we were going to meet Ringo. And I remember that distinctly because at the time I'd known him for about a year, and we had spent every minute of like the first half of that year joined at the hip in Australia, New Zealand. And when Ringo put that band together and it was official and Joe was taking me to meet him, I'd never seen him more excited and nervous. And then again, a year later or so, when he took me to the, I want to say it was maybe SIR, whatever the rehearsal studio was, he was very, very excited. And I did read in Felder's book that apparently it was supposed to have happened sooner, but Joe had missed some dates or something like that. So I was surprised to read that just because I hadn't been aware of it, but I may have been and I've just forgotten, but I don't think so. I remember feeling like, oh, this is brand new news. I wake up this morning, I'm yanked out of bed and I'm going to meet all the Eagles. And of course, like you said, Glenn Frey wasn't there. Yeah. I will say that Don Henley could not have been sweeter. It was the first time I had met him. As soon as he found out I was from Texas, he was, we started comparing notes on Texas, and he was just unbelievably sweet and gentlemanly and gracious. And of course, that's the thing about Henley, is that on any given day, he could be like a total pompous, agitated, barking jerk. for no reason. Like he would just open the door that way, and then other times he would just be, the greatest guy you could ever meet.
Oh, sure.
Whereas Glenn Fry was just always kind of aloof and kind of a jerk, that I remember. Of course, when I first met Glenn Fry, I was a crack addict, so putting that in context, and maybe he had every right to be that way too.
Well, if yours was the only account that described him like that, maybe, but I've read a lot of things that, you're pretty much in line with.
And Felder and Timothy B. I had toured with Timothy B. as part of Ringo's band, so
you're right. That's right.
Yeah. And he could not have been sweeter. I mean, he was, when he found out, that was when I met him, because he wasn't in Ringo's first band, he was in Ringo's second band, I think.
Yeah,
so,
that's
yeah, so I met him at the recording studio when the Eagles got back together, and he couldn't have been sweeter either. He found out I was a vegetarian. He started writing down all of his favorite vegetarian restaurants, and even which dishes I should get at which. I mean, for the girlfriend of a rock star, you never know how others are going to treat you. Some will be a little careful because they don't know how long you're going to last. Others couldn't care less about you. You're just you're just some chick who's in the way of them jamming with their buddy. And then others are just unbelievably sweet, like, Townsend and John Candy and Ringo Starr. Felder, I always adored, and I liked the way Joe was around Felder, because kind of like with Rick, he just seemed to really relax and be himself and just be, happy and comfortable around Felder and Rick the bass player more than anyone.
Oh, that's great. So you read Felder's book. What did you think of it?
It's been a while since I read it, but I mean, it was great. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
It was sad.
Yes.
What happened. I always felt like, a little bit of maturity, or maybe a few therapy sessions. Didn't Metallica get therapy? Didn't Metallica?
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
I always felt like if the Eagles had a few group therapy sessions or something, they would have.
Sure.
It would have saved them all a lot of heartache. I felt like it was terrible what had happened. I also felt like Felder, more than anyone, except maybe Joe, saw the Eagles as a family. And Joe was smart enough, it seemed to me, Joe was smart enough to just, he knew how to pick his battles. And, he knew the only way to be in that band was to let the two dictators be dictators.
Yeah.
And Felder just wouldn't allow that to happen, and it was a losing battle. And I think Joe knew it. I think Timothy probably knew it.
Yeah.
And Don, I think that there was, the book came across to me that for Felder, he was hurt that suddenly it wasn't the family or the brotherhood that it used to be, and he just wouldn't let that go, and it turned into this big thing. What I heard through the grapevine, I won't say from where, was that when he wrote that book, it had a lot more juicy details in it, and he ended up getting paid a lot more money for what he took out.
Oh yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. Just because, I do know he got a settlement when he finally settled all the legal stuff with the rest of the guys. But
I'd love to read that book.
Yeah, it was a fun book, and I read part of it when I did the part 2 of my Joe Walsh podcast, because I think the saddest part, the most heartbreaking part of the book, is when Don Felder calls Joe after he got fired and says, "Hey man, they fired me. What do I do, or what are we going to do?" And Joe, is in this impossible position of well, I don't have a say in this, and Felder has rage at Joe, and it's just God, what an awful situation. And I think what you were saying earlier, some therapy sessions might have, cooled some nerves, but it sounds like a lot of that was, about money, and there's not a lot of therapy that can fix money problems, right?
That's true. It's true. And that probably is definitely the saddest of all. It's not so much, I think it was terribly sad that Felder left the band, because if I went to see the Eagles without Felder, it would have been a noticeable vacuum. I just thought he was so integral to the Eagles music that I loved. But that Joe and his friendship suffered the way it did. I want to think that they're friends now. I mean, that maybe they don't advertise it, but that they've reconnected. I mean, Joe's a really forgiving sort. He's very non-confrontational, you know, and that's just a very, very intricate part of his personality. I mean, that's one of his defining features. Is Joe is very confrontation averse, and yeah. So,
well, not with you.
Huh?
Not with me. You.
Yeah, I mean. I used to be very confrontation averse. I mean, I'm less so now. I'll be confrontational when it's appropriate. But we were two non-confrontational people that would, you know, stuff down, and then it would blow up, and then you get, you know, 1,000-fold confrontation that turned into like actual violence. Yeah, that's, you know. But I know. Non-confrontational people will tell you that that's kind of what it's like. I mean, I know a lot of Canadians that are the sweetest people in the world, and then like every 10 years they'll blow up like, you know, nothing you've ever seen, because that stuff goes down somewhere. Sure. It's got to come out, you know.
Yeah, that's funny. Oh man. Yeah, I saw another interview with Felder from a couple of years ago where he says that they were both that they don't hang, but they leave notes for each other at radio stations when they do like morning talk show appearances. So if Felder is promoting a record, he'll leave a little note for Joe. A couple months later, Joe will come get the note and then leave one for Felder, and that sort of.
Oh my God, that's so cute.
Yeah, right. And it's just like that seems to be like the quiet behind the scenes sort of reconciliation you hope for, and with such a, you know, sad, heartbreaking story in a book. One thing that Felder's book and your book have in common is that you both sort of put the spotlight on the real, like, sterile, behind-the-scenes element of the '94 reunion, and sort of how, like, that tour, those shows was kind of a facade, because even though everybody was technically getting along, it seems like there wasn't a lot of love between the guys during that tour, and they kept to themselves. So when you were on that tour with Joe, what was your experience with, like, I guess I'd call it Eagles World backstage? Like, did you see the other guys in the band very often, or was everybody kind of cornered off?
I would say very much they were cornered off. In the very beginning, I didn't go to the rehearsals, maybe one in the very beginning, if I recall. And I don't think I went to one. But I knew people, aside from Joe, I knew some people who were there working it, and so I would hear stories. When I went to that soft opening for the Hell Freezes Over tour, which was like mostly for industry people and friends and family, you know, I was backstage, and there was I don't want to say a friendliness or warmth or much interaction, but certainly more so than I saw at any time for the rest of the tour. And, you know, they each had their own trailer, and they had their families with them. So nobody came into Joe's trailer except for Felder right before the show. I'm sitting there with Joe. It was, you know, he was nervous. I'd never seen him so nervous. Literally never in my life. Oh, he was just catatonic almost, honestly. And I felt very helpless, because I wanted to say something to be encouraging, you know, but he was just, when you're newly sober and you have so much self-doubt and shame, and even with all the rehearsals, you know, it was his first time sort of back on stage, and surrounded by guys who had their shit together, you know.
Oh, like, sure.
And Joe was a little intimidated too by their, you know, Henley's singing voice, and Timothy, you know, for one thing, Joe never considered himself, you know, a great singer. I mean, he definitely was good and had his unique sound, but those guys had just been knocking it out of the park the whole time he'd been spiraling. So, and he didn't want to disappoint anybody. He didn't want to screw up. And Felder came by and stuck his head in the door, and he could see how nervous he was, and he made a little joke. I talk about it in my book. It was the first time that Joe actually kind of took a deep breath, and he seemed to relax a little bit. And then they go out. But, none of the other guys came in. They all sort of kept to themselves a little bit. We saw them backstage, and like I said, there was, what seemed like a normal sort of level of friendliness. And then when the tour started, I only would meet up with him like once a month or something. And
okay.
But it was very, maybe a little bit more than that in the beginning, but by the end of the year, but it was very noticeable. And in fact, so noticeable, especially compared to all the other tours we'd been on, where it was very much of a family atmosphere, from Herb's in New Zealand to Ringo Starr's tours, especially to all the many tours we did with Joe just as a three-piece. Everybody hung out together. We ate together, talked together. At the very least, when you're on the elevator together, you're chatting, you're acknowledging each other's presence. Yeah. And that's the one memory that stands out more than anything, is we were on the way to a show. We're at this hotel. We get on the elevator. I won't say who, but one of the other Eagles was on. We stop at another floor. Another one of the Eagles get on. There are 3 Eagles in the elevator, maybe a road manager or assistant or something. There's like 6 of us. And they didn't look at each other. They didn't greet each other. They were like total strangers. And I'm like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. We walked through the lobby, and they all got into their separate, cars to go to and I don't think they interacted again until they were on stage.
Gosh, that's like working in an office building. Like before COVID, that's like how I would be at work, getting into an elevator, look at my phone,
Yeah. Nobody had cell phones back then, but I guarantee you everyone would have been looking at them if they'd have had them. Sure.
Did you ever see, did you ever meet their manager, Irving Azoff?
I may have, but I don't have any recollection of it. I feel like I must have, but I don't remember it at all.
Yeah, well, maybe it's not that memorable. So, before the reunion kicked off, you must have heard, and maybe I'm asking you things you can't share, but did Joe share stories about his time in the Eagles and, what maybe he loved about them or what frustrated him about them? Did he talk a lot about them, or were they sort of out of sight, out of mind when he wasn't with them?
He talked about them some. I think he chose his words carefully.
As we all do.
My impression, he did tell me things in confidence, and it's been so long that I don't even know if I put this in the book. I'm almost certain I didn't, actually. I probably would have been afraid of a lawsuit. But I will tell you what I remember, and this is just my memory. First of all, whenever he did speak of them, it was with the emotional vibe that I got was that a lot like the way I talked about my family. With love, okay. You never knew if the story, always about people that I love and am very close with, but the story may be, something sweet, something funny, or something incredibly hurtful and frustrating. It was, it sounded like he was talking about his brothers. And so not all the stories were good. Some were funny. I think one of the most, when he chose his words very carefully whenever he was saying something that wasn't positive. Yeah. And I remember one time him being very candid, and it came out, what he said came out in a way that was just very unguarded. It was just like a gut reaction. I had asked him something about the debauchery and the groupies and all of that of being with the Eagles. And it's funny because Joe had a lot of affairs when we were together. I say a lot. For a rock star, probably not,
Yeah.
But for a typical couple, most women would have considered, once you get past the digits on one hand, once you get to half a dozen, you would say a lot. But he said, he said with complete, I want to say disgust, he did not sugarcoat this at all. He thought the behavior of the married members of the band screwing around as much as they did was a little despicable. And I don't know if he used that word, but, you know, he also followed that up with a comment about maybe the age of some of those backstage girls.
Sure.
And maybe, I mean, I'll tell you straight up, he was disgusted at the use of quaaludes with young girls.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's not, I don't think you're speaking that far out of school, because there's, it's matter of public record that, like, a 14-year-old girl died at one of Don Henley's parties. You know, and I think it was a drug overdose. And it's, you know, it's one of those things where they don't want to talk about it, but it's like, that's a real thing that was in the newspapers. And, you know, a gross of a story as that is, Henley got so mad about the coverage he got that he wrote Dirty Laundry, which Joe played on. Full circle.
Yeah. And, you know, it's a great song.
Of course, right.
It's not a great song. And here's the thing. I will say also, because, you know, this is something that's really interesting to me. People are definitely becoming more aware.
Yeah.
I definitely feel like the pendulum at some points swings way too hard to one. And you have to look at the 70s and 80s in the context of the 70s and 80s. I lost my virginity at 14, or at least I tried, with a much older man who the next day, I got him, let me tell you the story real quick. I met him, he was a grad student, he's probably 22 years old. I was so attracted to him. He looked just like my favorite soap opera star. I got him drunk. I very consciously, strategically got the man drunk and seduced him at 14.
Oh, wow.
And the next day, I went to see him, you know, to say hi, you know, because I'd had a wonderful time.
Yeah.
And he was mortified. And I was shocked by that. And later I realized, well, he probably felt horrified at, you know, having been sexual with a 14-year-old. To this day, that incident has never scarred me in any way, shape, or form. Is for all my immaturity, especially when it comes to drugs and alcohol. Sexually, I always knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. And if something didn't work out the way I wanted, or if something went too far, even at 14, 15, 16, I accepted it as part of the trial and error of becoming a sexual person and figuring all that out. I was not, you know, I have a lot of trauma in my past, but that was not part of it. And there are other women like me out there. There are also a lot of women at 14, 15 who can get really, really screwed up by that stuff. You don't know which, you can't vet them when they come in the door. You know, you don't know which 14-year-olds are actually gonna enjoy their time backstage, getting messed up and have a fond memory forever, and which ones are actually going to be traumatized by it. Yeah. So, you know, and you also can't really control everyone who makes it backstage or to your parties. I'm sure in LA, it's not like they were checking IDs at the door and doing like maturity tests or, you know, psychological evaluations of these girls. So should they have been more careful? Probably, but I mean, in the context of the time, a 14-year-old girl, if she wants to get backstage and appear older and seduce a man, you know, not all men are going to be prepared for that, or be, you know, I mean, it's, there's some ownership that even young girls have to take, you know. I knew what I was doing at 14. I absolutely knew what I was doing at 14. 100% I did. Yeah,
I've read a lot of, I think Kathy Valentine from the Go-Go's just put out an autobiography, and she talked about some similar topics like that. And I've read a lot of rock biographies, and, you know, underage girls getting backstage is absolutely a universal theme. There is definitely a context of the times to it, but, you know, the unfortunate thing is years later is all that stuff, you know, a lot of it is really, you know, there's a very, very dark side to that. And sometimes it gets taken out of that context, I recall when David Bowie died, there were some nasty websites that, called him a predator and, a pedophile and all these things because there were accounts of him having affairs with like 15-year-old girls. And it's just like, it becomes weaponized and fodder, and it's a real bummer. So, go ahead.
I think that I do want to add, I think that, I can't think of their names, but some of those groupies that Bowie was sleeping with that were 14 and 15 years old, whatever, I think that they have stated that they don't regret that at all.
Correct. Right.
So so you have to, if you're going to believe all women and respect women's stories, you have to respect the women who don't regret those things and would not want to give up those memories or those situations. I do also want to say there's a difference between sexual situations and drugs, because a 14, 15-year-old's brain is not equipped. I don't care how mature you are sexually, you're not equipped to handle drugs at that age. So there is a very distinct line there.
Well, that's affecting brain chemistry, absolutely. Another one that comes to mind is Rae Dawn Chong, the actress, just last year or 2 years ago, said she had an affair with Mick Jagger when she was 15, and then as soon as she said it, she realized, oh my God, I'm going to get him in trouble. No, I knew what I was doing. This isn't Me Too, that kind of thing. And I like what you said. It's just like, if you believe all women, you have to believe the part where they say, like, I don't regret this, and I'm glad I did it.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, I don't really have a clever segue to my next topic. I wasn't prepared for this topic, but it's a good one.
I got a little deep there on you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great to talk about. I'm just it doesn't take much to go over my head. But the next thing I really wanted to ask you about, because you were sort of in this. You were in this A-list world where you were around a lot of celebrities and you were at these VIP parties. But you were there as a partner of one of the VIPs. So what was your experience of, I guess, and I hope, please don't take this as disrespectful, but what was it like being like celebrity adjacent? Does that make sense?
Oh no, I was absolutely celebrity adjacent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, I don't like being in the spotlight, so it was actually a pretty comfortable place for me,
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And Joe was always really good about that. Like, he didn't when we were together at parties or with hanging out with big other celebrities, like, for example, when we ran into Jack Nicholson and Pete Townsend at the Royalton that time, he didn't just like sort of abandon me or not introduce me. He always introduced me. He always introduced me as, this is my lady, Christy. He always and then he almost always would follow that up with, isn't she beautiful, or aren't her freckles beautiful? Or I remember he introduced me to Les Paul.
I'm from Wisconsin. Les Paul's a hero.
Oh yeah, he really looked up to him a lot. I mean, he spoke of him with such reverence.
Yeah.
And it was immediately after that whole thing with the Eagles in 90, not working out, that we went to see, Joe had a Letterman appearance, and we went to see Les play at Fat Tuesdays, I think is the name of the club, and Les put him on stage, and there's a video of it on YouTube somewhere, but he just adored him. So Joe introduced me to him, and he says, this is my lady Christy, she's from Texas, she's got freckles, he's just being silly, and Les looks at him like, I don't care if and he says this, I don't care if she has freckles. And he turns to me and he's like, it's lovely to meet you. Like, he was giving Joe shit. It was so cute. Like his, why are you being so goofy? It was funny. But Joe always would introduce me and say something sweet. And he always made, even if we were fighting sometimes, he just kind of went out of his way to make sure everyone knew that I was his life partner. I mean, we sort of saw ourselves as a permanent couple, and so in that respect it was a great place to be, because I didn't have to be in the spotlight, and some celebrities would just look right through me, and others would just stop and talk to me and get to know me, like Harry Nilsson, for example. You know, I mean, he couldn't have been sweeter. And he said, when I met him, he said, Joe has been talking about you all day. He's told me all about you. Wolfman Jack said the same thing. When I would hear that Joe had been telling his friends about me when I was not with him, when I was back home in Austin, and I'd fly out to LA and he'd introduce me to people like, oh, I've been hearing about you for weeks. Oh my God, it's so nice to meet you. You make Joe so happy. It was wonderful. Yeah.
Okay. Well, was there a downside to that celebrity experience? Like, did Joe and you have to worry about paparazzi or tabloid magazines or anything like that?
You know, I can't recall any negative press or any harassment per se. I do know that, like, Joe was very careful about his reputation. So, for example, when Howard Stern put me on the air that time, by calling the hotel, you know, Joe and Rick were in the studio. Joe had gone to the bathroom, and Rick said, hey, you got to call Joe's new girlfriend. She's a stripper, and get her on the air. And so Howard gets me on the air real quick, and I started answering questions about our sex life because I'm half asleep and I don't really know who Howard Stern is. And Rick thought that was just insanely funny. Joe was livid when he got back to the hotel. And it was the first time I'd ever really grasped that the things I say and do are going to reflect on a big scale for him, you know? I mean,
okay, sure.
Yeah, like when I said that thing about when Howard asked if we'd had ever had threesomes, and I said yes, part of why I was honest about it was because I thought, well, you know, all guys like, you know, to have that studly image, but Joe was, you know, a little different. He didn't want his sex life to be out there at all. And, you know, he was just private about that stuff. And, you know, I remember being in New Zealand, and when word would get out that he was there, whether it was at a restaurant, and one time we were just like antiquing, and somebody recognized him, and all of a sudden in the middle of this, you know, little quiet street, there's people everywhere surrounding us. He reached through the crowd because they kind of pushed me out and pulled me back in. Like he was always really great with his fans. Like he would never be rude and say, I don't have time for, I mean, I've heard stories of him being rude, but my guess is it happened at a time when he was just like really drunk or hungover or something. Yeah. And I did not ever witness him being rude to fans who wanted autographs or who came up to him in stores. I saw him being rude to people randomly, like bartenders and flight attendants, when he was drunk or jonesing, you know, or super hungover. He could just be the biggest jerk in the world. It wasn't frequent that happened, but he was always very appreciative of his fans. I think he was a little terrified that our drug use and like certain stories, like when I beat the crap out of him or tried to beat him up in the back of that limo, and then the limo driver, of course, was fully aware of what had just taken place. Like he did worry about that stuff getting to the press because he didn't want his fans to know what an addict he was or what a dysfunctional relationship he was in. Yeah. He wanted to keep that stuff private. I mean, I think he also, you know, it wasn't just his fans. I think he worried about what his mom would think, you know.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I just think of that story in your book about when you're at that campsite and he walks past where the other campers were playing Hotel California, and like his reaction sounded like abject terror. Like, we have to get out of here, you know.
Yeah.
Was he worried that they were just going to come, they wouldn't leave him alone, or had he experiences where fans couldn't take a hint to get lost, or was it because he was intoxicated?
My take on that was that he had been we were on that RV trip to get away from the drugs that had gotten out of control. Once I moved in with him, my already spiraling coke addiction just, you know, exploded. And so like 8 months in, he's like, we're going to get an RV, we're going to clean up, we're going to just drive up the coast, see some friends, commune with nature. And little by little, the RV filled up with drugs so that it turned into like this fear and loathing kind of a thing. And so he recognized that he was not the rock star at the top of his game that his fans expected and wanted. And I know that the amount of drugs that we ended up bringing and my our use of them in just that first week, he was disappointed in himself. He was disappointed in me. He was disappointed in himself. And so, he looked kind of haggard, and it was a very tense day, that day that we were climbing. We weren't talking a lot, but it was nice to be in Joshua Tree. And so as we're walking back to the RV, I think hearing himself on their boombox, my take on it was always, that was a reminder of who he used to be and wasn't anymore. And God forbid they look up and see him and walk over, they're going to realize, oh, he looks like hell.
Right.
And
yeah.
his girlfriend looks wired. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, he didn't want them to see him in that less than prime state. And I think that it made him feel so bad about where he was in life and with his addictions and with a girlfriend who was clearly out of control, that as soon as we got back to the RV, he just dumped out a bunch of lines, because it's kind of like, well, let's just, let's just numb that feeling and get obliterated,
It's really funny you said Fear and Loathing, because I can't show you my my updated outline here, but I literally pulled the quote of the list of drugs and booze that you have in your book and put it right next to that opening paragraph from Fear and Loathing. And I was going to read both of them and been like, when did you realize you were Hunter S. Thompson?
We had 2 bags of grass, 75 pellets of mescaline, 5 sheets of high-powered blotter acid, a salt shaker half full of cocaine, a whole galaxy of multicolored uppers, downers, screamers, laughers, also a quarter tequila, quarter rum, case of beer, pint of raw ether, 2 dozen amyls. Not that we needed all that for the trip, but once you get locked into a serious drug collection, the tendency is to push it as far as you can.
I read Fear and Loathing, I think after I got sober, and I was just like, oh my God. That RV trip, I wonder if I was possessed by the spirit of Hunter S. Thompson, because it was so similar. It was a trip. I haven't read it since. I read it that one time. So this would have been like 20 years ago or something. I'll have to put them side by side. Oh my God.
That was just too funny for me. So I don't suppose you ever met him. I know he was friends with like Jimmy Buffett of all people. Did Joe ever know Hunter? That you know of?
Not that I know of, but it does seem like they should have known each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? They could have done some damage.
And that was Kristin Casey, author of Rock Monster, My Life with Joe Walsh. This was part 1 of our full interview. Part 2 is coming probably sometime next week. Our discussion in part 2 moves a little bit away from Joe, and we hear some of her great stories about meeting big-name celebrity rock stars like Bob Dylan, Stevie Nicks, Ringo Starr, plus some lesser-known but equally interesting guys like Wolfman Jack and Dave Edmunds. And the second part of that interview, we talk about the other aspect of her book that has been received really well, which is the topic of drug addiction, recovery, and sobriety. Kristin has some really great insight into the issue of drug addiction and recovery, and I really appreciate that she took some time to expand upon those topics in part 2. So keep your ears open for that. That's coming up soon. I just gotta say thanks one more time to Kristin for stopping by. It really meant a lot as the first guest of this show to me. So thank you, Kristin. Hopefully you'll come back soon. And how many times can I say this one? Buy her book. It's really good. It's if you're a rock and roll fan, if you're a Joe Walsh fan, Eagles fan, there is so much great stuff in here, and it's a very accessible, fun read. I can't recommend it enough. And again, paperback copies are now available. She has signed copies available. You can find out all the information for that on her website, which is KristinCasey.com. You can find her social media there, at Ms. Kristin Casey on Twitter. You can follow her on Facebook too. Once you buy her book and follow her on all that social media, you should then make sure you're following us on social media. I'm over at Play That Podcast, all one word, on Twitter. And if you search Play That Rock and Roll or Play That Podcast, all one word, on Facebook, you'll find our page there as well. And we're also on YouTube. The audio version of this podcast, it should be available almost everywhere podcasts are available now. I know we're on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, and wherever we're not, I am in the process of working to get us there. So we'll be there soon. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, I would say please, please, please leave us a 5-star rating and a nice review. This show is still very young. We're less than a year old, so any reviews and positive ratings are so important and much appreciated in this first year as we're just finding our feet. So if you can just take a moment to do that, I would really appreciate it. That's a fantastic way to provide non-financial support for the show, and that's all the support I'm interested in, by the way. Non-financial, and the top 4 ways you can do that is A, listen to the show, B, recommend the show to a friend, C, follow us on social media, and D, leave us a nice review over on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you can leave reviews. All of that is very much appreciated. So with that, I just want to say thanks again for listening. I hope you had a good time. Keep an eye out for part 2 that's coming soon. And one last time, Joe Walsh, play us out.
Absolutely one of my favorite podcasts. Got to give them a listen.
Yes!